Yo, welcome to Alpha Omega University. Welcome back, everybody. I got to double check these things, making sure everything's working fine. I'm still having the issue, as you can see with the videos. There's nothing I can do about it at this point. So I'm just gonna, this is just the way we're gonna have to roll, but it's all right. It's all right. Yo, we are back. We got episode 28 today, Tsunami, right? We are continuing the series that we started a couple weeks ago, right? So remember, it's gonna be 1 week. We're gonna do the series, the calling style series, which is what we're talking about today. And then a week after is going to be something else, right? Something more generic and stuff. You saw the schedule right now at the beginning of the show there. So you can look at that. If you're on Twitch, you can scroll down. It's on the about section underneath. You can see the schedule there as well. Make sure you guys like, subscribe if you want to. You don't have to. The content is free. It will continue to be free. But, if you're on YouTube, especially if you're on YouTube watching this, hit the subscribe button. It helps me out a lot. And it tells me that you are enjoying what you are watching. And that means that, we're doing our job here, right? We're doing our job. I want to make sure that, we're trying to learn, right? We're trying to learn and get better, obviously. But at the same time, we don't want to have a boring time, just like sitting there like hitting the books, right? Which is really what we're doing, right? That's really what we're doing. We ain't kidding nobody here. We're fucking nerding out on the game here, but at least we're gonna try to add a little bit of spice to it, right? And so if you like the spice, a little bit of the spice, then hit that like button, hit that subscribe, hit the follow if you haven't already. I appreciate you all. Yo, Toshiro, what's up, man? I haven't seen you in a few times. I haven't seen you in a little while, man. How you been? How you been? So today we got Tsunami, right? So last time we talked about, we did the bait and switch episode, right? That was episode 26, the bait and switch. That's the style that the majority of callers right now are doing. Okay, it's very simply, right? It's where they engage with one party or something like that. They bait the enemy's main engage and then they counter with their full engage, right? Or they engage shallow, they back up early, make the enemy engage only on the tanks, survive it with defenses, whatever it is, and then you counter again with the full engage, right? So pretty basic, right? I'll tell you just the truth. These strategies, these calling styles, none of them are complex to understand, right? None of them are complex to understand. They're complex to apply, right? And so understanding what the enemy is doing while you're in that moment, right? While you're inside the fight and you're like, you're getting hit with shit and you're popping your defenses and you're counting down engages and all this stuff, right? Being able to on top of managing all those things, your positioning, your defensives, your engage, your attacking, right? All of those things, the terrain and the map awareness, all that stuff, right? So on top of like doing all of those things, then you also got to look at, well, what's the enemy's strategy here, right? And that's exactly what we go on with this series here, is understanding the enemy's strategy. And then after we understand it, right, like on paper, then we can go out on the field ourselves individually and start trying to understand how that actually plays out in a ZvZ, right? So that's the whole point of this series. Like I said, it's basic, but understanding the things that you got to look at to be able to see what the enemy's actual strategy is the most important thing. Okay, that way you can get better. And I can promise you guys, the best players in the game, they do this stuff constantly. They may not call it like how I call it, like Tsunami or Flood or whatever. Like, they might not call it these things, right? These are kind of things that I'm calling it just to kind of put a name on it, because the majority of these things don't have names. And it's interesting that I was talking about names because just a few days ago, I was talking to somebody that was asking me a question regarding like a certain area on a territory, right? On a farm territory. And he was talking to me about like that northwest wall of the territory that goes into the tower, right? If you know what I'm talking about, then you know. If you don't, then whatever. But essentially, he was asking like, hey, does that area have a name, right? Like because he wants to be able to communicate with his buddies and say, hey, like that area, does it like what can we call it? What do we say about that area? It's like, hey, I need you to go stand on Sector A or whatever the fuck you're gonna call it, right? And so he was asking me like, oh, what's like the Albion name for that? And the truth is, it's like I told him, I'm like, there's no name, like there's no name for that, right? And so one of the issues that I that I have encountered is that a lot of the things in the game are just simply not named, right? And it's something that we don't think about. We just say, okay, yeah, we don't, like it doesn't matter, whatever. But I want you guys to realize that naming things actually makes everything much easier to command your Zerg and to command a large group of people. It makes it so much easier to tell people like, hey, go to the courtyard, right? We call it the courtyard, right? Like nobody ever called it the courtyard except like players ourselves. We started calling it that, right? So things like that, it's like, oh, go to the west tower, and that one's kind of simple, right? Because it's like, okay, well, it's a tower and it's on the west. Obviously, it's a fucking west tower. But the thing about it is that there are certain areas like that little narrow northwest wall. Like, what do you call it, right? So, if you establish naming conventions for different things that you want to do, then it's going to make it easier for your Zerg to be able to follow those calls, right? And that's not just in leadership. That's also, like individual players. Okay. So if you're thinking like, okay, like, I don't know, someone says like, hey, we got to flank them from somewhere. And you're like, oh yeah, we can flank them from, I don't know, fucking whatever you want to call it, like wall 3, call it whatever you want, or you can call it something fancy or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. The point is that people understand it, right? So that's also part of what I'm doing when I call things like Tsunami, right? Like the episode today, Tsunami, I call it Tsunami. The bait and switch episode, right? I'm calling it bait and switch. The truth is that these naming conventions aren't really used. Like, that's the truth. They're not used, right? Most people for Tsunami, they call it like flood, right? But the problem with flood is that it tends to be very back and forth, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, flood into the enemy, and then you come out of them, and you don't actually stay inside the enemy, which is what we're going to talk about. But anyway, I know I probably lost some of you guys. Are like, what the hell is this guy rambling about, right? But they're important things, man. They're important things. You got to realize that everything in this game, at some point, was given a name by somebody, and that somebody benefited by simply giving things a name, right? Like like the like right now we're watching a video, right? We're watching this video. It's in a tunnel, right? And this tunnel, right? We can say, oh, if I tell you guys like, oh, hey, we're gonna go to the one-way choke, right? We're gonna go to the one-way choke. We're gonna go and take defensive position on the one-way choke. I bet you, if you've played ZvZ enough, especially in tunnels, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And if you think about it, that map actually has like 3 different one-way chokes, right? So, but you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say one-way choke. There are certain maps that used to be longer ago, the wood style maps. If you're old, man, if you've been playing this game a long time, then you remember the old map in Mercia. There was a zone called Elmwood, right? And in Elmwood, in the center of the map, there was this hill, right? And it was like a one-way hill. There was like basically you go up there and then you can't get off. Like the enemy's gonna. It's a one-way, right? It's a one-way, and so. If people are like, oh yeah, we're going to take the fight on the hill, everybody instantly knew where the fight was going to be, right? And that's very important. So anyway, naming conventions has nothing to do with this episode, but it is something important that you guys should look more into. At least establish naming conventions within your guild. That'll make communication easier for you guys. Toshiro said, took a break of the game after I left CIR to spend time with... Oh, that's good, man. That's good. Family time is always important, man. As much as we talk about like the game and everything, and we have fun and all these things, man, at the end of the day, family comes first, right? And real life stuff comes first all the time. So yeah, man, that's good for you, man. Good for you. I've been good, man. I've been good. I went to Reject Party. I left CIR a couple weeks ago now, and I went to Reject Party. It didn't work out there, so I left Reject Party. So right now, my main character doesn't have a guild. But I mean, I'm still a militant, right? Because that's my guild for like NA. But I don't really have an EU guild right now. Most of the EU guilds are like, they're either completely full because people are like in hype stages for a lot of those guilds, or they're just not fighting much, right? And so I don't, I don't feel like committing to any guild right now that is simply not going to be committing to fights. So that's what's going on. Anyway, so let's get on to it. We already rambled for 10 minutes. Let's talk about the episode today. So episode 28, Tsunami. So we're going to do the same kind of thing that we did last time. The only thing different today that we did it with bait and switch. The only difference today is that I'm not actually going to show you videos at the end of the episode. I don't have too much time today. So I can't go over the video section at the end. Either way though, here's the thing. The style we're going over today, Tsunami, right? It's literally almost every single ZvZ for the past 3 months, right? This is the last season. Okay, and I bet you the videos that we're watching right now, I bet you're gonna see exactly this happening over and over and over and over. All right, it's not happening right now, but I'm sure that they're gonna dive into the enemy at some point, and they're gonna stay inside the enemy, and it's that's what's happening, right? So it's very basic, like I said, Tsunami is very basic. The strategy is what we're gonna talk about first, right? Flooding the enemy, all of that, right? And what the purpose of that is. Then we're going to talk about cutting the distance. And what that means is that, well, if you're going to flood the enemy, the first thing you got to do is you got to cut the distance, right? You got to get close to the enemy. You cannot keep them at arm's strength. You have to get in there, right? So how do we accomplish that? How do we accomplish cutting the distance? Then we're going to talk about what the actual flood is and what it looks like, right? Like when I say like, okay, what is the tsunami? Like what is the flood? Like what happens, what do you see in that scenario, right? Like that's exactly what we're going to go over with the flood section. Then we're going to talk about some brain games, right? Remember, I told you guys last time with the bait and switch episode, the brain games section is basically like the stuff that makes the enemy make mistakes, and that's either the enemy as in the Zerg or the enemy as in the caller, right? And it's brain games as in like what makes it harder for them to just simply play or defeat you or kill you or whatever it might be, right? At the very end, we're going to go over the aftermath, all right? And basically what happens after you have already, flooded the enemy, right? What is the goal of this whole flood style? What is the purpose? What is the end goal? Obviously, you're going to be like, oh, well, come on. Like the end goal is fucking to kill the enemy and win. Okay, all right, but like I know I said it's basic, but it ain't that basic. All right, like there's a specific purpose to using the tsunami style versus something like a kiting style, right? Like a when you're engaging the enemy, you keep backing up off the enemy and you kite them all the way across the map, which used to be the style that was dominating for many years. Last used around like a year and a half, 2 years ago. Right. So now the flood style, the tsunami style that we're talking about today is the major one that everybody kind of tends to do more. Now, before I tell you guys about the actual strategy and all of that, I'm going to give you guys a disclaimer. And this is a very big disclaimer because it's very important to understand. OK, this tactic is extremely very powerful, right? It's obviously very good. It's been used the entire last season by the top guilds. Were using this strategy, okay, to defeat their opponents. And I'm talking about like Sex and Flex, Escalation, Fax, Pora was using it, like when they were around, like all that. Like the top guilds were using this and they were being very successful with this style, okay? Here's the disclaimer. This style is most likely about to go out of fashion. Okay? And I say about to go out of fashion, but that's only because I like being careful with my words and not kind of like promising you guys something that I don't know for a fact. But to be honest, if I had to like set my foot on it, I think it's already out of style, right? Like that's the truth. Because the changes that have happened in the game have forced, basically players are playing differently now, and people are no longer following the same mentalities as before, right? When Stalker Jacket, Demon Fang was a hit, right? Being inside the enemy made sense, right? It worked because the Demon Fang made a lot of damage and the Stalker Jacket made a lot of damage as long as you were inside the enemy, or at least very close to the enemy, right? So those things were very important. And guess what? The entire Zerg revolved around those two things. And so therefore, the flood style just made sense. Now things have changed, and they changed quite a bit, right? The siege bow is much more powerful. Okay, they added things like the phase scale hat, which makes interrupts like uninterruptible stuff, right? And I know you're like, oh well, they're about to nerf like the heavy mace is gonna be able to purge and then silence, and which, by the way, if you don't know about that, go read the patch notes. We'll go over them when they actually go live. We'll actually go over them on the stream, but I'm not gonna do it today. But essentially, yeah, they're reworking both one-handed arcane and heavy mace so that they purge first and then silence. So therefore, one heavy mace or one-handed arcane can actually stop a siege bow bomb squad with phase scale hats. This is not live yet, at least not that I know of. I wasn't paying attention too much to the game in the last couple of days, but I'm pretty sure it hasn't been live. I think it's going to be live probably in the next couple of weeks. But anyway, so those things are very important. They're part of they're part of the reason why flood style was king for the last 2 seasons and maybe even half a season before that, right? But now it's basically going to be gone because Demon Fang got nerfed over and over and over again, right? But beyond it being nerfed over and over again, that didn't have as big an effect as the fact that Stalker Jacket was broken, right? Stalker Jacket was just dealing too much damage, and when you overlapped it, it gave me, if you've been around a while, it reminded me of the Spectral Jacket meta, right? When Spectral Jacket was just deleting everybody because it was just doing way too much damage and all that, right? It was burning everybody to death, and yeah, so it kind of had that vibe, right? So I already knew that Stalker Jacket had to be nerfed, and a lot of times people are like, "Oh, well, the meta's only changing because SBI changed the things." It's like, no. SBI made a mistake in the first place by allowing those weapons to be so strong for so long. It was inevitable that they were going to change, the Stalker Jacket, the Demon Fang. And if anybody ever talked to me personally, I told them, Demon Fang, Stalker Jacket, they're going to be gone by the end of this season, which was last season, right? I even said it like episode 2 or 3, whatever episode, destroying the meta. If you've seen that episode, I literally said it back then, right? I said that was gonna be dead, and here we are now. Yes, this style is dying. Now, is it gonna be completely gone? No. The difference is that you have to understand these styles, all these styles, they come and go at different times, but just because they are not the meta does not mean they are not used at all. Like, I'll put it this way. If I'm writing a kite comp, right, which is the exact opposite of Tsunami. If I'm writing a kite comp and I'm just kiting back, at some point, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to flood the enemy. And the reason is because that's probably when I have seen that my enemy has lost enough tanks, enough front line, and now it's time to finish the back line, right? And so what I'm saying is that this style is always going to be around. So it's important to know about it. But it's just understand that this is not going to be the number one style anymore, like it has been for the last few seasons, to be honest. All right. So here we go with the strategy. The strategy is, oh, and by the way, if you guys have questions, comments, concerns, drop them in the chat. I am reading right now. If you have questions, comments, concerns, anytime that I'm not live, you can go to the Discord, and then you can, the link is below. You can just go down below and get on the link for the Discord, and you can talk to me there whenever you want. I will respond, and I do enjoy these conversations, obviously, right? So I don't mind. You won't bother me, I promise. I enjoy answering these questions. So, all right, the strategy, what the actual strategy of Tsunami is, it's, like I said, it's flooding the enemy, right? What does that mean? The goal is to literally get inside of the enemy with your entire Zerg where you no longer have a front line, right? That's the point. The whole point of a flood style is to make it so that neither you nor the enemy has a front line established. Now, a lot of people can say, oh, well, no, that's not the point. The point is to just, get really close to the enemy so that, you can be ready to hit them because you have a bunch of melees. It's like, yeah, that's a consequence though, but that's not the point. The point is to have no front line. And I'll tell you guys why, right? The reason is that if you don't have a front line and the enemy doesn't have a front line established, right? What that means is that the enemy no longer knows what direction they should engage in, right? Because basically they're going to see name tags to their southwest, they're going to see name tags to their north, to their south, and to their east. They're going to be all around them. And so all they can realize is, okay, I have a lot of enemies everywhere. Where is the enemy front line? We are so conditioned as players to locate the enemy front line and to engage on the enemy front line. However, when there is no front line, what are we supposed to do? Now, the individual players that are like higher skilled, like high level players, right? Those players are gonna be fine. Why? Because they've been in this situation many times before and they know how to handle it. However, the majority of lower skill players, or even average skill, I'm not even talking about low only, I'm talking about low and average skill players. The majority of people are simply not going to be able to deal with that chaos. And that's the point. It's chaos. This entire flood style is to put chaos into the enemy where they don't know where to engage because they don't know where your front line is. And on top of that, the enemy Zerg also doesn't know where to position themselves. Think about this. If you're a healer, right? If you're a healer, where are you going to be positioning yourself? Well, generally speaking, you don't want to be in the front, right? So what you need to do is you need to stay back a little bit, but you also want to be within range of the center of your front line. Especially you want to be in range of your caller because your caller is usually at the center of the front line. So that's great. So if you want to do that, if you're a healer and you're like, okay, I want to be a little bit behind the front line, but then guess what? You no longer have a front line. So then where should you stand? If you no longer have that anchor point, which is the front line, to define how far back you're going to stand, then suddenly you have no front line. Then how can you decide how far back is too far back or how far forward is too far forward? You have no idea because you have no front line. Right? That is the whole point. Now, again, an experienced healer and everything will no longer look for that front line, right? They're going to instead look at, okay, let me see where the deepest concentration of enemies is, right? Where does it look like they are following calls and what is, dissecting the enemy's calls and understanding them. But that is so much harder to do than to simply look at your front line and be like, yeah, I should be, half a screen behind them. Right? That's simple. But to be able to diagnose the enemy and then appropriately define within the terrain where you should be standing relative to the rest of your Zerg, that is very, very, very high level stuff, which is exactly why this style became a major thing. I've talked about it before. If you haven't watched the first few episodes that we did, it was like episode 1, 2, and 3. They were basically focused on metas and stuff like that, and why these metas came to be and things like that, right? So if you didn't watch those, go back and watch them. I push you guys to watch those because they're gonna be very important to the changes that are coming now, right? So essentially what I'm saying is that those back then I mentioned, right, that the reason that a lot of these changes happened where flood style took a big leap forward and it became the major aspect of ZvZ, including at high levels, right? Because, and the reason I mentioned that, give you a little bit of history here, is because flood style had been used obviously by everybody, but it had never been used as a major critical strategic component of any Zerg except for one Zerg, and that one Zerg was Arch, right? Arch, their only strategy was literally to just run you down, right? And just get inside of you and just keep running you down with numbers, right? That was the point. Now it's different because now you actually have the highest level players in the game, the highest level callers in the game, going out there and doing these things where they're literally using this style that had previously only been used by, Arch tier Zergs, right? So my point is that they use this style because the game as a whole, after Blue Army and after Elevate both disbanded and their coalitions basically disbanded, and a lot of their members went everywhere, right? Because of that, there was a big loss in player skill across the entire game, right? Now, when you look at the numbers that SBI has put out, the number of players participating in open world ZvZ increased exponentially, right? However, that number went up exponentially, but what went down exponentially was the number of players that participated in open world ZvZ that were already experienced for multiple years. That's because those two guilds disbanded, right? Elevate and Blue Army. Okay. And so what happened is it created a huge gap in knowledge for so many players across the entire game. So therefore, this strategy of flooding the enemy, it causes chaos to an enemy that does not know how to deal with this chaos, right? A very, very basically trained player in Albion, right? Say an average or below average player in Albion, ZvZ player in Albion, they will use the front line as a reference point as to where they should be standing and what they should be doing, right? If their front line backs up, they back up. If the front line walks forward, they walk forward. It doesn't matter anything else, whether the call is to walk forward or back up, right? This is why so often you see big zergs of very new players just run away, because their front line backed off. And so then everybody behind them was like, well, if my front line backs off, then I got to back off too. And then everybody backs off, right? And that's the point. So what I'm saying is that this flood style, it's a Zerg to Zerg strategy. Remember I told you guys last time, the bait and switch strategy in episode 26, that one was actually a caller to caller strategy, right? Because you're trying to play these games from one caller to another, trying to mess with their head, trying to get them to call a bad engage. Really, that's all it is. Now, this strategy, the Tsunami and Flood strategy, right? This is basically a Zerg to Zerg strategy, right? It doesn't take on the strengths or weaknesses of the caller as much. Don't get me wrong, it does matter, but it doesn't matter as much. What matters more is the quality of Zergs, okay? This is also why high quality Zergs right now seem so unbeatable. It's not because they're unbeatable, but rather it's because everything depends on the Zerg quality, and the majority of the game has a lower Zerg quality. So it makes it really simple, right? The moment you flood into the enemy, you create the chaos. They no longer know where their front line is. They no longer know where they should stand, and they no longer can follow calls appropriately. That is the Tsunami style in a nutshell, right? And if you don't believe me, go ask like any of the top callers, any of the top guilds in the game, and ask them, why is it that Tsunami style is so powerful, right? Why is it that this style is actually so big? I remember I actually had a conversation with Del Negro. And if you don't know who Del Negro is, he's the main caller for Escalation, right? So obviously Escalation's up there, right? So I had a conversation with Del Negro maybe like 7 months ago, or something like that, okay? And I had a conversation with him about this specifically, and what he said was that the reason that he calls in this flood style is because it is easier for lower tier Zergs to accomplish, right? Because you can get your Zerg to just tell them, hey, engage the enemy, right? And that's very simple. Now, I want you guys to differentiate what I just said, okay? I don't want you guys to get confused here, okay? One thing is that when you are attacked by a flood style, that is very hard for you to deal with if you're an average or below average player. On the flip side, if you are attacking with a flood style, that is actually very easy for you to accomplish if you are not an experienced player, okay? So basically what I'm saying is that flood style is easy to accomplish, but flood style is hard to mitigate, okay? Here's why. Because flood style, when you engage the enemy and you just tell your Zerg, hey guys, flood the enemy, that's a very simple call, right? That's a very simple call. So your Zerg is just like, okay, that basically means I get to do whatever I want as long as I go into the enemy, right? So lower tier Zergs, lower tier players are able to follow that call because it's pretty simple. It basically means, hey, don't worry about a front line. Just go inside the enemy, right? And so they know that. While the other enemy that's actually receiving a flood style, that the enemy is attacking them with a flood style, right? Well, that guy, he's sitting there and he's also low tier, but you know what his mentality is? His mentality is, I have a front line, right? And that's his mentality. And then when that front line just disappears, then suddenly that player no longer knows what to do, right? So it's a mentality shift is what I'm saying. And so what I'm explaining is that essentially flood style is very easy to accomplish if you're the one doing it, right? And if your Zerg knows that that's what's going to happen, okay? But if you're the Zerg that's trying to defend against it, it's very, very hard. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier. Arch used to run the flood style. Why? Because it's easy for players to accomplish, right? It's easy for players to accomplish. And so even though Escalation, even 6-7 months ago, whenever I talked to him, Escalation was still the number one Zerg at the time, right? And so even though they were the number one Zerg at the time, even they were doing the flood style because they realized that they had issues with skill on their Zerg. They had skill issues in their Zerg, right? So when a lot of times people go and tell me like, hey, you know, I'm having a lot of issues with my Zerg. My Zerg is a bunch of new people who haven't played the game for more than a few months to a year at the most, right? They're like, what can I do to recruit higher tier people? And it's like, listen, the truth is that there's not a lot out there. Like there really isn't. Like the majority of players, of ZvZ players in the game, like literally the high majority of the ZvZ players in the game are way lower in skill level than they were 3-4 years ago. That's just the truth. There's not that many really high level players in the game. So that kind of flips, right? If you are a high level player in the game, then just know that you are a very, very hot commodity, right? Like a lot of people want you by their side because you can help teach their members who need the teaching, right? That is very important. So anyway, like I said, Tsunami style is a Zerg to Zerg strategy, right? It focuses on the enemy Zerg's inability to respond to the loss of their front line. And by loss, I don't mean their death, like their front line got killed. I mean simply by like they no longer have a front line established, right? Now, obviously, this strategy is mostly used with melee Zergs, right? Melee heavy Zergs, which is also why I'm saying that this strategy is about to go down a lot, is because right now there's a big shift and Zergs are running more and more and more ranged DPS. And I promise you the next style that's going to be meta is probably going to be Kite, right? Now, Kite is much harder to accomplish, but we have an episode on that, so I won't get too deep into it. But basically, that style is probably going to be the dominant one pretty soon. All right. Now, I don't know for a fact, right? We'll see. We'll see. I mean, everybody has a different style, but we'll see. That's my prediction, right? So, we'll see what happens. So this style is very good against less experienced or less disciplined Zergs. All right. That's very, very important to understand. So the next thing we're going to talk about is cutting the distance, right? So now that we understand why the flood style works and why we want to accomplish it, right? Now we got to realize, well, okay, wanting to accomplish it and actually accomplishing it are two different things, okay? Now, with that, give me about 10 seconds because I got to turn on the AC, man. It's getting hot. It's summer. It's getting warm, man. Give me a minute. All right, I'm back. Let me put this video back on. There we go. All right. It's getting warm, man. It's summer. Summer's finally here. It took a while, though. It's already the end of June. We're already looking at July, and the heat barely came in. All right, so cutting the distance is the next section. All right. Let me drink some water, too, actually. Got to stay hydrated. Use this as a reminder that you should hydrate, too. Get a cup of water. Go drink some water. Stay hydrated. All right, so cutting the distance, right? The way you have to accomplish cutting the distance is pretty simple, right? You can walk into the enemy, right? You can literally tell your Zerg, hey guys, walk into the enemy. I mean, that's the easiest thing that you can do, right? But what happens if they go and kite you, right? What happens if they push you off with Qs and Ws and like you start trying to walk into them and then suddenly there's this barrage of fucking Qs and Ws and you just get a bunch of damage on you out of nowhere, you're just like, shit, I gotta back off. Like I can't just keep walking into the enemy, right? So you can't always just simply walk into the enemy. However, right, it's not a bad idea to try, right? Because a lot of Zergs are just really bad, right? And they'll see you walking into them and they're just like, okay, yeah, we're just gonna let you walk in. And they don't drop any Qs or Ws or auto attacks. This is why I've said it many times before. If you watched the other episodes, I repeat it over and over. Qs, Ws, and auto attacks win ZvZs. They really do. It's not the E's that win ZvZs. It's the Qs, Ws, and auto attacks. And it's because of this. You can prevent the enemy from flooding you simply by using a good amount of Qs, Ws, and auto attacks. So what you can do is you can try to just walk in. But if the enemy doesn't allow that, then another thing you can do is you can engage and then push the enemy, right? So this is what the majority, I would say, of people do. Okay, they go and call and engage to say, okay, we're gonna engage northeast in 3, 2, 1, hit them northeast, and now flood them, right? Now you flood them, now spread inside of them, now, you know, whatever, right? Instead of saying, you know, the majority of people that used to run kite back in the day, it used to be you engage and then you back off, right? Because you want to hit and kite back, right? That's the point. But for the Tsunami style, it's completely opposite, right? It's a completely different thing. You're going to engage and you actually want to push the enemy, because the engage is not necessarily to get kills. Although if your Zerg is a really good Zerg, then you're probably going to get kills, but that doesn't matter. The point of engaging is simply that you can use the engage because it's going to give your Zerg sprints, right? So your Zerg is going to sprint towards the enemy, but at the same time, your tanks are going to be CCing the enemy, so they're going to stop them from moving back, right? At the same time, the enemy has to pop defensives and all those things, which makes their character stop. Think about it. A Locust drops a Locust. Now they're channeling for a few seconds while their Locust is expanding. The Enigmatic, same thing. The Fallen goes and throws the Fallen. He has to cast it, whatever, right? So all these different things, right? The disengaged tanks, they have to turn around and go inside of your Zerg to be able to stop them, right? So all those things basically mean that when you engage the enemy has to stop moving, okay? Whether they want to or not, they're going to have to stop moving unless they want to fucking get shit on. I mean, you want to get shit on, then go ahead, right? But essentially, this is why it works, okay? Because you engage, the enemy has to stop moving and do whatever they're going to do, and then you just walk into them and you spread, right? And it's beautiful to do it that way because, well, what's the enemy going to do? They're going to counter engage you, sure, but if you spread quickly enough, then there's literally nothing they can do. Like, that's the truth. There's literally nothing they can do if you spread quickly enough, because they're going to hit you, but where are they going to engage? Think about it. You hit their front line and then you spread inside of them at every direction. And then your caller, you know, goes and says, or actually, like the enemy hits you and the enemy spreads all inside of you in every direction, right? And then your caller's like, all right, get ready to hit them northeast in 3, 2, 1, hit them northeast, right? Or hit them southeast, wherever the enemy came from. And so when you go and look, it's like southeast, and you look southeast and you're like, well, there's nobody fucking there, right? They're all inside of us. They're not southeast. So then you're like, okay, do I follow the call? Okay, well, I'll follow the call. I'm going to hit southeast and hit like 3 people. Or do I look around at what's inside of me and be like, okay, there's a clump over here on my west. I'm going to hit the fucking clump on the west. But then you're going to hit it by yourself, right? So that's the point. So engage and push works really well because it stops the enemy, which means you cut the distance. You also have sprints going forward. So it forces your Zerg to go in. Also, your Zerg is melee. So when they go into the enemy, they are now in range of hitting their E. So everything works out perfect, right? Now, there's a third way of cutting the distance, and that is simply holding the line, right? Now, this means that when the enemy engages you, instead of backing off and instead of like, kiting back and, you know what I mean? Like spreading out and trying to like absorb the damage, instead of doing that, just literally stand there and take the damage, right? Just take the damage and just trust your healers, trust your supports, trust your gig pot, your resist pot, whatever it is that you got, you know, trust that, and hopefully you survive. And if you survive, then suddenly the enemy's already inside of you, right? So then, therefore, if they engage you and you don't move, you are now inside of the enemy. So if the enemy backs off, you're still inside of them because they already wasted their sprints, so they can't run away from you. But you haven't wasted your sprints, so you can still run all the way to the back line, right? So this is another tactic you can just do, is just hold the line. The problem with this tactic is that essentially you're gonna lose your defensives. Like, that's the point, right? You're gonna lose your defensives. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't care to have defensives, then it doesn't matter, because either way, the enemy already engaged, right? So you use your defenses to stop their engage. So you won't need them again until their next engage, but you're hoping that you're going to have a better position by their next engage, right? Because otherwise, if you don't have the position by the next engage, you're also not going to have defensives, and you're probably going to be screwed. The last one for cutting the distance, and now this specific tactic hasn't been used too much, except for Zergs like PoE. PoE does this a lot, right? And that's because this is actually a harder one to do. Not in the terms of individual players, but in the terms of callers, right? So the macro behind this is actually harder, and this is why a lot of callers tend not to do this, because it's tougher macro. And now PoE Syndic is really good at macro, right? I've said that many times before. He's probably the best right now at macro, hands down, right? And so what they do is, to cut the distance, is you split your forces in two and you just sandwich the enemy, right? Sounds very simple, but it's really hard to do. Okay, so you split your Zerg, and that basically means that half your Zerg is going to be vulnerable while the other half is going around behind the enemy to try to flank them, right? Now, once you do flank them, what you're going to do is you're going to both hit both sides at the same time, sandwich them, right? This is a classic, sandwich style. But after you hit them, you don't come back, you stay inside of them. So it's the same thing as the engage and push. The difference is that you're sandwiching the enemy in. Now, what is the difference between engage and push and sandwich? So engage and push has a drawback, that if the enemy kites back when you engage, then you're not going to catch them. Even if you engage and push, you're not going to catch them. In fact, they're going to string you out and probably kill your front line, right? This is actually exactly how kite works. It's exactly what kite is supposed to do, right? Good kite Zergs will do this all day long. And I'm telling you, man, like, I have kited around an entire map, circle and circle and circle around the map, 45-minute fights, 50-minute fights. Like, I'm not kidding, right? Like, I've done this before, and it's literally this. It's the enemy tries to engage and push, and all we are doing is just kiting them back. And so every time we turn around, we only hit their front line and we keep on kiting, right? So that's the problem with engage and push. However, with sandwich, what the sandwich tactic helps with is that you're splitting your Zerg, so it forces the enemy to be boxed in, right? So ideally, you want to split your Zerg to box the enemy in so that they cannot kite away from you. That's the point. So the point is not to, like, scare them or be like, yeah, I surrounded you, aha, like, that's not the point. The point is simply to make sure that the enemy can't get out anywhere. They can't just kite back anywhere, right? And so back in in Blue Army used to do this like 99% of the fights, right? Blue Army used to do this like all the time, okay? And the truth is the time that we used to die, because I was in Blue Army at the time. So the times that we used to die to enemy Zergs who were running a flood style, because some did, I know PoE did it for a little while. It was when they would split and cut off our exits, cut off our kite routes, right? When they would do that, there was no way out for us and we would die. Like, it's just that simple, right? So sandwich, very, very useful. However, it obviously puts half of your Zerg in jeopardy while your other half goes and rotates, right? Engage and push, it's not always effective if the enemy is kiting well. And hold the line is good and it works great, except for the fact that you got to put yourself in harm's way, right? You got to hold the line and not back up while they're literally engaging your face. Like, that's tough, right? And then obviously the simple walk-in is the last one we talked about. Well, the first one we talked about. The simple walk-in is just literally just trying to walk into the enemy. But again, that only works against like super, super, super terrible enemy callers or enemy Zergs, right? Like, that doesn't work against like any average tier Zerg. It doesn't work against them. So the next part that we're going to talk about is going to be the flood, the actual flood. So now that we've cut the distance, right? Now that we actually accomplished getting into the enemy, getting inside the enemy, now we're gonna look at the flood. The flood itself. What does that look like, right? The flood itself is gonna be basically spreading inside of the enemy, right? That is very simple to say, but it's very hard to do, okay? I want you guys to pay attention. What you need to do is when you go inside the enemy, you need to spread inside the enemy across their entire Zerg, not in their front line, not in their back line, everywhere. You wanna be completely like perfectly spread. You want to have an enemy north of you, an enemy south of you, an enemy west of you, and an enemy east of you. And at the same time, you want to have an ally northwest of you, southeast, southwest, and northeast, right? Why? Because that means that you are perfectly evenly spread across the entire Zerg, the enemy Zerg. Why is this important? Because if you clump with your allies, okay, if you clump with your allies, then what's gonna happen is that the enemy's gonna identify that clump as your front line, okay? Even if it's not your front line, and it's not necessarily that they think that's your front line, it doesn't matter. They're gonna look at that and be like, there's a lot of people there. By default, that's gonna be their front line now, right? It could be a bunch of fucking clothies. It doesn't matter. They're gonna think that's your front line. And if they think that's your front line, guess where the next engage is gonna happen, right? So you have to try your best to not clump with the allies. That way, it makes it really hard for the enemy to dictate where to call the next engage, right? That way, you want the enemy to call an engage south, and then their next engage north, and their next engage west. You don't want them to constantly call the engages directly southeast, directly southeast, directly southeast every single time. You don't want that, right? You want them to engage in different directions so that they are confused and lost. Now, how can you get them confused and lost? Well, you're already inside of them. The enemy already sees a bunch of name tags all around them, right? Like, you can kind of see it right now in the video right now that we're watching. It's Escalation against Albion, it's Vintage Alliance, right? And you can already see how when they go in, very oftentimes they just stay inside of them, right? Now, I know that right now they're fighting on a territory, so they can't really do it because of the territory. I assume the mage is up. No, the mage is not up. Anyway, look how deep this guy's going, right? This Demon Fang player. Look, and he's just staying in there, right? He's just staying in there. And now they're completely like starting to just spread around inside of them. The guys on the west, I think that's a bomb squad, right? I mean, this fight is pretty much over, but you get the point, right? You're getting inside of them, and now you no longer know, the enemy no longer will know what direction to engage in. Now, the majority of escalation here in this video is actually still in the south, so but this fight is pretty much, I mean, it's completely fucking over. Like, there's no reason. If I see something else that kind of mimics it, I'll show it to you guys. Anyway, so how do you continually keep the enemy confused, right? Just because you go inside the enemy does not mean they're going to be continually confused. They're going to be confused while you're in there, but if you stop moving, if you stop doing, you know, too many things, then suddenly they're going to kind of slow it down. They're going to get less pressure. They're going to be able to look at things and be like, okay, they are clearly setting up on the west side. That's their front line, right? And so you don't want that. What you want to do is you want to keep it moving. You don't want to stop moving at all. Don't ever stand in any specific area, in any specific spot. Don't be like, yeah, this area looks safe, I'm going to stand here. No, fuck that. Don't do that. Spread around and keep walking around, right? You go northeast, then you go southwest, then you go north, then you go southeast, right? Like, keep going in different directions so that the enemy does not ever have a hint of where exactly your front line is. Okay, now that's obviously only applicable if the enemy is not actually trying to kite away from you, right? But if they are trying to kite away from you, then what you can do is, as you're running into them and continually trying to stay inside of them, keep trying to shift directions at any point in time just to keep them on their toes. All right, don't stay in any specific area in relation to the enemy. Just because you're walking northeast does not mean that the enemy sees your name tag in any other place than the southwest. You need to think of the enemy name tag, or you need to think of the enemy's camera, and you have to basically make it so that in the enemy's camera, your name tag keeps doing circles around him. That's what you want to do. All right, I think that's the best way I can explain it. So the next thing you want to do is you want to annoy the enemy. All right. Now, all of this is obviously annoying the enemy. Everything I've told you so far is obviously really annoying to the enemy, but you want to annoy them even more, okay? What you want to do is you want to drop Qs, you want to drop Ws, you want to drop auto attacks. Why? Because those things bother the enemy even more, because they're already focusing on trying to look at all the fucking name tags in their map. They're always They're trying to look at where their front line is, where your front line is. They're trying to find their fucking collar, their little crown in the mess of enemies, right? They're trying to do all of these things, but yet now they have to worry about the fact that you're constantly attacking them, stunning them, rooting them, pushing them back, just doing damage in general, right? That is so incredibly annoying because it forces them to now focus on more things. It just gives the enemy more things to worry about. All right, that's the point. Now, with this style, all right, with this style, there's one absolutely critical component to this style. And if this does not happen, don't even try to do this style, okay? You need to have discipline. Discipline is the absolute key for the Flood style, okay? Don't get lost yourself while you are trying to confuse the enemy, all right? Don't get so caught up in trying to confuse the enemy and cause chaos to the enemy that you end up causing chaos to yourself, okay? Don't allow that to happen. You need to make sure that you are the one aggressing the enemy and making sure that they're the ones that are confused. If you start getting confused and you start getting out of discipline and you start losing the calls, like you don't no longer listening to the calls or you're doing other shit, then guess what? You lost your discipline, and because of that, this Flood style will not work, okay? You have to work together as a team, and you cannot just go and try to act like this is a solo game now because you're flooding the enemy. It's not, all right? Very important. Discipline, absolutely very important. You want to get the enemy to lose their discipline, but you need to retain your discipline. Okay, very important. So, the last thing about the Flood, okay, the last thing about the Flood is that you don't want to retreat for any reason, unless your caller says back up or something, right? Then okay. But if the caller does not say that, then you need to stay inside the enemy. Don't back out just because you get low on HP. Don't do it. If you need to die inside the enemy because your Zerg didn't heal you, then you die inside the enemy because your Zerg didn't heal you. And then go and complain to your fucking healers later. All right? But don't come out of inside the enemy, because if you do, you're gonna back away from the enemy. And guess what? You think you're gonna find heals somewhere else? Hell no, because your healers are also inside the enemy. There is no reason that you would find heals outside of the enemy Zerg. You're not going to find them, right? Now, if you back off a little bit, literally for a couple seconds, and then you come back in just because you're waiting on your Hellion jacket to pop back up or something like that, that's fine. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about completely trying to back away so that you can find a heal. Don't do it. You're going to find heals inside the enemy Zerg, or you're not going to find them at all. So you might as well stay inside the enemy Zerg. Again, that is also part of discipline. Very, very important for the Flood style, right? Now, the next part is going to be the brain games, right? What kind of brain games are we looking for with this style? I mean, I've already talked about quite a few of them, right? But we're going to talk about even more of them, right? We talked about the chaos because they see enemy name tags everywhere. We already talked about that extensively, so I won't go too much into it. But essentially, angles, right? Angles is one of the main ones, main components of this style, right? It's that you're exploiting the enemy's angles. See, like the fight we're watching right now. In this fight, it's a choke fight, right? And so the enemy's directly northeast, and that's it, right? You don't have to worry about anything else, right? So look at all those bodies on that river. It's because it's so simple. It's so simple. All the enemies are going to be on that river, so you just hit that river. It's really that easy, right? So the point of this style is actually to do the opposite, where you don't know where the enemy is because the enemy is literally everywhere, right? You don't know where to hit the angles, right? The angles are the most important thing, is that they don't know to engage north, south, east, or west. And so that's the strength of this style. Now, another thing that you can do to play brain games on the enemy is that you want to engage different places, all right? Remember, you don't want the enemy to engage the same place, right? You want them to be engaging different angles, right? But that's because you want them to be lost. But for you, you do want to engage different places. You don't want to engage the same exact area of the enemy every time, okay? What I mean by this is if you see the enemy clumping up on the southeast and the northwest, hit the northwest. And then you still see the southeast still clump, then hit the southeast, right? And then they clump on the northeast, then hit the northeast, right? Don't hit the same exact place every single time. Why? Because if you do that, then you're effectively establishing a front line again, okay? The more times that you hit the same angle or the same direction, the easier it's gonna be for the enemy to anticipate where your front line is, and that way it's gonna make it easier for them to pop defensives against you, or at the minimum to, you know, use disengaged tanks against you. All right, so that's very, very important. Hit different directions, hit different places in the enemy Zerg so that they don't know what angle to defend against. Okay, now at the same time, when you do engage, don't put all your damage together in the same place. What do I mean by this? Try to have some few DPS that use their E not directly on the clump, but rather other places. Why? Because that will allow the enemy to see damage popping across their entire Zerg and not just localized in one small area. When they see damage hit in one small area, then it gives the enemy a sense of where your front line is, okay? But if they see damage coming across the entire Zerg, then they don't see where your Zerg is actually coming from as much. And it makes it more chaotic for them to be able to call a counter engage, okay? This is also why Zergs like Escalation and Sex and Flex, okay? They both do this. I know King Just for Escalation, the caller for Escalation, King Just, he does this a lot. Almost every single ZvZ that I've seen him call, he does this. He goes and has his first party engage in one angle, and then he has the rest of the Zerg engage in a whole separate angle every single time, right? And if you watch this video and just keep that in mind, you're gonna notice it because he does it every single time, right? So because it's important, because it's useful, right? It helps keep the enemy off balance, all right? Now, at the same time, you don't want to split your engages too much where now suddenly you're not killing anything, right? At the end of the day, you got to get kills. So being able to manage that is important, all right? Now, here's one more last brain games that you can play on the enemy, all right? One last brain game. So, target priority, okay? That is very important. Find the enemy healers and put pressure on them. Qs, Ws, auto attacks, whatever. That way, they focus on healing themselves and not the Zerg. See, if you're hitting a tank or a DPS, right? Then, okay, they have to worry, just like I mentioned earlier, they now have to worry about, okay, the angles, but also where their front line is, where your front line is. They got to worry about the calls. They got to worry about their positioning, right? But then on top of that, they also got to worry about the fact that somebody's hitting them, right? Okay, well, that's all they have to do. It's just, okay, this guy's hitting me. I'm gonna move away from him, right? Okay, fine. However, a healer has to now heal himself. If he's getting hit, he's gonna have to heal himself. And that's very important because then you put his heals on cooldown. If they're running the AoE Q on Holy, because they're idiot healers, right? They're running that shit, then guess what? You just put their Q on a 3-second cooldown. That's massive, right? Now, if they're, you know, if they're a nature, then it doesn't matter as much because they're gonna put stacks on themselves to put breeze anyway. So it's not going to matter as much. But if you can find holy healers, especially those that have AoE Q, make sure that you're putting specifically more pressure on them because you're going to put their shit on cooldown even more. All right. So that's very, very important. All right. So now we're going to talk about the aftermath. All right. And this is the last section. I told you guys today was going to be a little more short episode. All right. So we're all done. And I know that some of you guys appreciate it, man, because I know you guys prefer the shorter, quick episodes than the ones that we go for like an hour and a half, almost 2 hours, right? I understand it. It's a long time. I'm also trying to cut down on the amount of time on the episodes, by the way. I'm trying to make it more between an hour and a half. So I don't know if you guys have noticed it, but that's one of the things I'm trying to do because over an hour and a half is a little much for everybody, including myself. All right, so the last thing we're talking about. Toshiro says, this pressure on healers can legit be seen in every competitive gameplay. Crystals in particular. Absolutely. It's actually very I'm glad that you bring up the crystals, because everybody seems to think that the way you play in like 5v5, 10v10, 20v20, right? Like smaller scale stuff, right? Has nothing to do with the way you play in larger scale ZvZs, 30, 40, 50v50, or even more, 100v100, right? Completely wrong, right? Things that matter in 5v5s, they also matter in ZvZ. It just matters in a different way, okay? The pressure that you can put on healers, like it's automatic. Like if you guys go and do an arena, just a fucking 5v5 arena, right? So often you see players who are like 2 million kill fame players are like, yeah, guys, we need to go and put pressure on the enemy. Everybody focus the enemy, or focus the healer. Sorry, to put pressure on the healer, right? Everybody focus the healer. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. I mean, it's a great strategy, right? They're not wrong. But it's like, what I'm trying to explain is that is such a known thing to put pressure on healers that even people who have 2 mil kill fame are out there fucking yelling at the top of their lungs, right? And you can say, oh, well, that's arena. Bullshit. It's the same thing across the board. It's the same game, right? If the enemy healer has to worry about healing themselves, guess what? They're not healing their allies. If the enemy healer is out of position because you kept putting pressure on him, then suddenly they can't heal their allies, right? And if the enemy can't get heals, the enemy's gonna die. It's just that simple. It's a pretty straightforward thing. It's just that you have to be able to apply it. Now, obviously, it's that application that is hard, right? Like, you can say, okay, yeah, but I can't put too much pressure on healers. Well, that's the point. In this style, in Flood style, you absolutely can, because you are literally inside of the enemy, right? You're literally completely inside the enemy. And so therefore, you're going to be right next to their healers. So putting pressure on them is very, very, very easy. All right. Now, the last part, the aftermath, right? The aftermath. What is the goals and the aftermath of getting the Flood style, right? What is the enemy going to do? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what the enemy is going to do. Okay. Well, the enemy has a few options. All right. The first option is that the enemy is going to overspread. Okay. What I mean by this is that if you go inside the enemy and you spread out inside the enemy effectively, and you're putting pressure on them and everything, right? Think about it. Every guy that you're putting pressure on with Qs and Ws and auto attacks, they're going to try to back off of you, right? And if they back off of you, and then your buddy is doing the same thing on somebody else far to your west, and they're doing the same exact thing to another guy over there, and that guy backs off to the northwest, and the guy you're pushing away backs off to the northeast, then suddenly you just spread their Zerg even further, right? Now you can say, oh, well, that's just 2 people. The enemy has 150 people. Okay, I don't care. It doesn't matter, because you also have 150 people, hopefully, right? And that means that your Zerg is also making sure that more and more of the enemy keeps getting spread, because now you also have a buddy in the far south who is pushing an enemy to the southwest. So now the enemy Zerg is getting so spread out completely in every direction that what happens is that they can no longer engage on you effectively because they are way too spread. Think about it. If the call says engage southwest, the guy you pushed off northeast is nowhere near the call. Even with a sprint, he's not going to get there, right? If the enemy calls to engage, in the southeast, then okay, the guy in the northwest won't be able to get there, right? Because your buddy pushed that guy away, right? So that's the point, is the enemy is going to overspread. Now, the enemy won't overspread if you don't put significant pressure on them, right? So it's your job to go in there and put as much pressure on them as possible, right? But if you do it right, the enemy is going to spread so thin that every one of their engages is going to be weaker and weaker and weaker. And if you don't believe me, watch any of the ZvZs between Sexton Flex and Escalation of the last season. Okay, and I know we're watching one right now, but it's completely different now because again, like I said, the metas are completely different now. Like they're still changing. We don't have a set meta yet, by the way. If you think that the meta is set right now, you're crazy. Like, everybody's experimenting with a bunch of different things, and I don't know exactly what's going to come out of this meta, except for the fact that I'm pretty sure it's going to be Kite. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is that you watch those videos, and I promise you what's going to happen is that once these Zergs get inside of each other, one of the Zergs is going to continue dealing massive damage every engage, while the other Zerg is going to deal less and less damage with every engage. And it's going to get to the point where that other Zerg is no longer getting kills because they're just not getting enough damage in. That is literally every single fight of the entire last season. I promise you. Go back and watch them, right? And it's important to go back and watch them because that's how you actually understand what is happening, okay? So the enemy is basically too spread out to be effective on the field. That's one of the things that can happen, right? Another thing that can happen with this flood style is that the enemy didn't spread enough, all right? So instead of spreading way too much to the point that they're ineffective, the enemy simply didn't spread enough. And what happened is that you surrounded them everywhere and they didn't spread. So what happened is that now you're completely punishing the shit out of them because they're still clumped, right? They're still clumped and you're running a clump and dump style. So therefore, guess what? All your damage is getting put out on those guys and they're gonna die because they're clumped and you're not, you're spread, right? So that's another issue. So it's kind of like, if you guys don't know what the Goldilocks zone is, the Goldilocks zone is basically like, you know, in astronomy where a planet is not too far, but not too close to a star, so that it actually has a good amount of heat. The planet has a good amount of heat and cold, so that way it's habitable for human life. That's what we call it, the Goldilocks zone. All right. I like astronomy. I told you guys I'm a nerd. I don't give a fuck. Astronomy's cool. All right. But yeah, so that's the Goldilocks zone, right? So what you want to do is the enemy has to find that Goldilocks zone, right? They have to spread out, but they can't spread out too much because then they become ineffective. And they also don't want to spread out too little because then you just clump them and kill them, right? Those are the two major things that happen. However, there are other things that can happen, okay? One of them is that the enemy scattered, all right? This means that the enemy lost their discipline and or their morale, all right? And they simply ran away, okay? Maybe they just got lost by all the shit that was happening. They completely lost their collar. They completely lost their Zerg. And now suddenly they have to go around, mount up, and, you know, try to find their Zerg, right? So they're effectively scattering. They're all over the place, okay? This is what happens primarily when you see a Zerg that is lower tier go up against the flood style, is they usually will end up scattering because they lose their discipline, they lose their morale, and they run away. All right. And the last thing that can happen as a result of the flood style, of the tsunami style, is that the enemy simply becomes ineffective. Okay. They may have gotten that Goldilocks zone amount of spread. Okay. They may have spread just right. Not too much, not too little. They may have just spread perfectly. Okay. And maybe they're not completely losing their discipline. Maybe they're not completely running away, right? Maybe they still have some morale left in the fight. Okay. However, they can still become ineffective. And how? It's because they lost their ability to engage because they simply don't know what direction your front line is in. And this is why I talked a lot about it, right? I talked a lot about the enemy front line. I talked a lot about your front line, the name tags and the directions, the angles, right? This is what I call the angular chaos, right? Angular chaos is because there is chaos that has to do with the angles in which the enemy is in, or which you are in relative to the enemy, right? They lose their ability to engage you simply because they don't know where to engage. I want you guys to picture this. If I'm the caller and I call my Zerg and we're, you know, the enemy's inside of my Zerg, right? And I call my Zerg and I look west and I'm like, yo, there's a massive clump to the west. They fucked up. We're going to catch them here. We're going to fucking kill them. We're going to win this fight, boys. Hell yeah, let's go, right? And I'm like, get ready to hit them west. Deep as fuck. We're going to kill them in 3, in 2, in 1. And then nobody drops any damage. Nobody. Not a single one of my people drops damage. And I'm like, yo, what's going on? I got the biggest clump. You know, my juggernaut got like 50 people. Oh my God. Right? And I'm going crazy. And there's no fucking damage. And then I'm like, yo, where's my damage? Oh, DPS, you guys are shit. Oh, you know, I get all mad, right? I'm sure that some of you guys are like, dude, that's happened to me every time. My caller, every time. I'm sure. But I say because that's exactly what happens, right? And what actually happened was that I engaged west because I saw this big ass clump west, and I'm the caller, and I see this clump west, and I'm like, yeah, we're gonna hit that shit right there, right? It's west, so I'm not wrong. But again, the enemy's all spread out inside of us, and we are spread out inside the enemy. And so what happens is that the guy that's north of me, he thinks I'm calling out a clump that is west of him, because he sees a clump of like 5 people west of him, and he's like, oh, that clump? Okay, I'm gonna hit that clump. So he goes in there and fucking, you know, drops his Demon Fang or drops his fucking Raven Strike or Spike Glove, whatever the fuck he's wearing, right? He drops his damage on these 4 or 5 people, and sure, maybe he does a little bit of damage, but he ain't gonna kill nobody by himself, right? And the guy south of me saw a clump west of him, right? And he's like, yeah, that must be the clump, and he did the same thing. And the guy east of me saw another clump, right, between me and him, and he decided to hit that clump. And so nobody but me saw the clump west, the one I actually wanted to hit west, right? And so because of that, our damage just spread out way too much. And effectively what happened is I am no longer able to call engages. As a caller, I'm no longer able to call engages. Why? Because even if I call an engage, my Zerg is completely in angular chaos. They don't know where to engage relative to my position, because they can't even find me, or because they themselves see different clumps everywhere. Because that's the point of this style. That's the major key of this style, right? Is to be able to create chaos to the enemy, where it becomes very, very, very complicated for the enemy to communicate effectively, right? Now, going back to what we were talking about earlier at the beginning of the episode, right? Kind of tying it all back in a little bit here. Remember I talked to you guys at the beginning of the episode about how, you know, naming conventions are important because it makes communication better, right? I want you guys to think about that, because if I were to say, hey guys, engage on the farm, right? As opposed to say, engage southwest, right? Let's say I'm northeast of the farm, me, myself, okay? And I say engage southwest. Then suddenly that might mean southwest of somebody that's a little bit north. They might end up hitting the zigzag of the farm, like north of the farm, right? In the territory. However, if I say hit the farm, the angular chaos no longer works, because even if my Zerg is lost as fuck and they don't see where I am, they don't see the front line, and they don't see the clump, and they don't see anything, even if they got their fucking eyes closed, right? Then they can still know that they should be looking to hit the farm, right? Now, I know they can't look if they got their eyes closed. All right, whatever. You understand what I'm saying, right? Because you put a naming convention onto something, right? It made it much easier. Basically, you eliminated the enemy's ability to create angular chaos onto your Zerg, all right? This is also why Flood style is not as effective in territories and castles as it is in open world. Because in territories and castles, there's a lot of naming conventions. But in open world, there's not a lot of naming conventions. So because of that, me as a caller, when I actually call, which is not often, I don't call very often at all. But when I do call on the, you know, every blue moon, right? What I do is I try to use identifiable markers as much as possible. And so this is kind of more of a tip for callers or aspiring callers, right? Try to not use angular directions as much as identifiable markers. So what do I mean by that? I want you guys to pay attention right now. We're looking at this video, right? This video that we're watching, it's escalation, right? Okay. What do I see here? I see a giant rock to the northeast. I'm not gonna call and be like, yeah, right next to the tree. Hit next to the tree. Okay, but it's like there's a tree south, there's a tree west, there's a tree north. Like, I'm not gonna say that, right? But if I say next to the giant rock, right? Hit next to the giant rock. Okay, then you're gonna know it's that rock northeast, right? Or the headquarters is another one, or like the hideout is another one, right? hit next to the hideout, or hit south of the hideout, hit west of the hideout, right? That eliminates angular chaos, because yes, you're still giving an angle, but you're giving an angle not relative to you, you're giving it relative to the object. So you're saying hit east of the giant rock, and so they're gonna hit east of the giant rock, right? And it doesn't matter where your Zerg is, it's, you know, that's gonna, this is also why angular chaos is no longer, it's not a thing. This is why flood style is not a thing in any choke fight, because in chokes, like we were seeing earlier, it's very simple, right? You just say, oh yeah, it's the choke. You don't have to worry about anything else. It's like, oh yeah, engage the enemy. You don't even have to say engage the enemy northeast or south or whatever the fuck. You just got to say hit the enemy. Why? Because obviously the enemy is only in one direction. They are at the other side of that choke, right? So makes it very, very simple. And with that, I think we are done. Let me see. Yep, we're done. We're done. All done. Yeah. All right. We got an hour and 15 minutes. That's pretty quick, considering the fact that we went through a lot of individual other things earlier. But anyway, we're done. You guys can ask any questions, comments, concerns that you guys have. Drop them in the chat right now. I am reading. Again, I appreciate you guys subscribe, like, comment, follow, whatever the fuck you want. All those things that people say. You know what I'm talking about. All right. I appreciate it a lot. We've got a lot of support lately from people, just messaging me saying, hey, yo, I appreciate you. These videos, they're making me, they're making me improve in the game and stuff like that. I've had some people, mention those things. I appreciate it, man. That's literally why I do it. That's literally why I do it. It's just to make sure that, like, you guys get the experience as much as possible and that you guys are enjoying it. So, all right, no questions, comments, concerns. All right. We're done. The next episode is gonna be episode 29. I don't remember what the episode name is. Let's check. We got this screen here. Episode 29. Oh, reading the enemy. Oh man, this is an episode that a lot of you guys have been asking for. Reading the enemy. Reading the enemy is gonna be an episode basically about how to understand what the enemy is doing, right? So all these things that we're talking about and how I tell you guys, pay attention to what the enemy is doing and all that. I'm basically going to tell you guys how to look for markers, how to look for, individual things that can tell you what the enemy is actually doing. So that way you can counter it effectively. So Shiro, wonderful episode as always. Yeah, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you. All right. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one.